The early morning sun peeked through the curtains as Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead. At 32, she never imagined she would be alone on this farm, trying to keep her parents' legacy alive. 3 months had passed since she inherited the property, and every day felt like fighting a losing battle. The old farmhouse creaked as Sarah moved around the kitchen, making her morning coffee. Outside, the fields stretched far, some still unplanted because she couldn't manage everything by herself. Her hands, once soft from office work in the city, were now rough and calloused. The phone rang, breaking the quiet morning. It was her sister, Lisa. "Sarah, how are you holding up?" Lisa's voice carried both concern and something else Sarah couldn't quite place. "I'm managing," Sarah lied, looking out at the overgrown parts of the farm. "What's up?" "It's about Jake," Lisa said. Sarah's mind drifted to her nephew. She hadn't seen him in almost 10 years, not since he was 18 and heading off to college. He had been a shy, quiet boy who always had his nose in books about plants and animals. He's finished his degree in agriculture and needs a place to stay while looking for jobs. I thought, maybe he could come help you on the farm. It would be good for both of you. Sarah hesitated. The farm had become her private world, a place to heal after her broken engagement and her parents' passing. But the truth was, she was drowning in work. When would he come? Sarah asked, already mentally clearing out the spare bedroom. 2 days later, Sarah stood on the porch, watching a dusty truck come up the long driveway. Her heart beat faster with nervousness. The truck stopped, and for a moment, no one got out. Then the driver's door opened, and Sarah had to catch her breath. Jake was no longer the skinny teenager she remembered. He stood tall, his shoulders broad from years of physical work. His face had matured, jawline stronger, but his eyes were the same kind blue ones she remembered. "Aunt Sarah," he called, a smile breaking across his face. "Just Sarah," she corrected, smiling back. "Aunt makes me feel ancient." Jake laughed, a warm sound that seemed to fit perfectly with the rustling trees around them. He grabbed his bags from the truck and walked toward her. "The place looks just like I remember," he said, looking around with appreciation. "Maybe a bit more challenging." Sarah followed his gaze to the fields that needed attention. "That's one way to put it. I'm in over my head." "Good thing I'm here then." Jake's confidence wasn't arrogant, just reassuring. He carried his bags inside as Sarah showed him to his room. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. Jake talked about his studies, his dreams for sustainable farming, and asked thoughtful questions about the property. "Why did you decide to keep it?" he asked, sipping the lemonade Sarah had made. "You could have sold it, gone back to the city." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "It's the last piece of my parents I have, and there's something about this land. It feels like home in a way nothing else ever has." Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I've never really had that. A place that felt completely mine." "Well," Sarah said, surprising herself, "maybe this can be your place too for a while." Their eyes met, and something unexpected passed between them. Sarah quickly looked away, blaming the fluttering in her stomach on too much coffee and too little sleep. As darkness fell around them, lightning bugs began to flicker in the fields. Without planning it, they stayed on that porch long into the night, talking like old friends rather than relatives who barely knew each other. For the first time since coming to the farm, Sarah didn't feel alone. And somehow, as she finally went to bed that night, the challenges ahead didn't seem quite so impossible anymore. A week passed and the farm was already changing. Jake woke up before sunrise each day, and Sarah often found him already working when she came downstairs. Today was no different as she watched him from the kitchen window, fixing the broken fence that had bothered her for months. The morning light touched his skin as he worked, shirt clinging to his back with sweat. Sarah made 2 cups of coffee and walked outside to join him. "You didn't have to start so early," she said, handing him a steaming cup. Jake smiled, taking the coffee. "I like the quiet of the morning. It's just me and the land." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Sarah felt a strange warmth travel up her arm. She stepped back quickly, pretending to be interested in his work on the fence. "I found some old papers in Dad's office last night," Sarah said. "Did you know you're not actually my biological nephew? Lisa adopted you when you were 2. I thought you knew." Jake looked surprised. "I knew I was adopted, but I never knew the details. Lissa always just said I was family, and that was enough. They stood in silence for a moment, something shifting in the air between them. Does that change things? Sarah asked, not sure why her heart was beating faster. Jake shook his head. Family is family, but it's interesting to know. After breakfast, they went to check the eastern field. Jake had ideas about crop rotation that could help improve the soil. As they walked, he explained his plans with excitement in his voice. The problem is here. He pointed to a section of land. We need to plant something that will put nutrients back in the soil. Sarah asked, smiling. Jake looked embarrassed. I mean, if you want me to stay and help. I don't want to assume. I want you to stay, Sarah said quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. The farm needs you. I need you. The last words slipped out before she could stop them. Jake's eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither spoke. A bird called somewhere in the distance. Then I'll stay, he said simply. That afternoon, a sudden rain shower caught them far from the house. They ran for the small tool shed, laughing as they pushed through the door, both soaking wet. The shed was tiny, forcing them to stand close. Sarah could smell Jake's scent, earth and sweat and something uniquely him. Her heart raced as raindrops fell from his hair onto his face. Without thinking, she reached up and wiped one away from his cheek. Jake went very still under her touch. Sarah, he whispered, his voice different than she had ever heard it. The sound of her name on his lips made her stomach flip. She quickly dropped her hand and turned to look out the small window at the rain. I was thinking, Jake said after a while, his voice back to normal, we could clear out that old garden behind the house. Plant some vegetables for ourselves. That would be nice, Sarah replied, grateful for the change of subject. Something that's just for us, not for selling. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started. As they walked back to the house, Jake surprised her by taking her hand to help her over a muddy section of the path. He didn't let go immediately, and Sarah didn't pull away. That night, they sat on the porch again, a habit they had quickly formed. The air was fresh after the rain, and fireflies danced in the gathering darkness. Tell me about your life before coming here, Sarah said. Jake talked about college, his few relationships that hadn't worked out, his dreams of having his own farm someday. Sarah watched his face as he spoke, noticing how his eyes lit up when he talked about the future. What about you? He asked. Any special someone waiting for you to go back to the city? Sarah laughed softly. No. My fiancé left when my parents died and I inherited this place. He didn't want a farmer's life. Jake frowned, his loss. Their eyes met again, and this time neither looked away for a long moment. Sarah finally broke the gaze, confused by the feelings stirring inside her. Jake was family, she reminded herself, but another voice whispered that he wasn't really her nephew, not by blood. That night, Sarah lay awake, listening to Jake moving around in the room next to hers, wondering why his presence in the house felt so right, and why her heart couldn't seem to remember the proper boundaries between them. Spring turned to summer, and the farm flourished under their care. The vegetable garden behind the house had become their special project, growing tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that filled the kitchen with fresh scents. They worked side by side each day, falling into a comfortable rhythm that made Sarah wonder how she had ever managed without Jake. One hot afternoon, they were harvesting the first ripe tomatoes when Jake suddenly stood up straight and stretched. We should go swimming, he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. There's that pond on the back of the property, right? Sarah hadn't been to the swimming hole since she was a teenager. I'm not sure it's even still there, she said, but Jake was already putting down his basket. Let's find out, he said with a grin that made him look younger. The pond was still there, hidden behind old oak trees, its water clear and inviting after their long walk. Jake didn't hesitate, pulling off his shirt and jumping in with just his shorts on. Sarah stood on the edge, suddenly shy. Come on, Jake called, floating on his back. The water's perfect. Sarah slowly took off her outer shirt, revealing the tank top she wore underneath. She stepped into the cool water, sighing with relief as it covered her hot skin. See, isn't this better than sweating in the garden? Jake asked, swimming closer to her. Sarah splashed water at him playfully in response. Jake laughed and splashed back, starting a water fight that left them both breathless and laughing. When they finally calmed down, they found themselves standing in waist-deep water, close enough that Sarah could see droplets clinging to Jake's eyelashes. Something in his expression changed as he looked at her, and her heart began to race. "We should probably head back," she said quickly, moving toward the shore. That evening, a letter arrived from Lisa. She wanted to visit in 2 weeks, to see how they were doing. Sarah felt a strange panic at the news. "Is everything okay?" Jake asked, noticing her expression as she read the letter. "Lisa wants to visit," Sarah said, setting the letter down. "Your mom." Jake nodded, a small frown forming between his eyebrows. "That's good, right?" "Of course," Sarah said too brightly. But the truth was, she had grown used to their private world on the farm. The thought of someone else entering it, even Lisa, felt like an intrusion. That night, they sat on their porch as usual, but a new tension hung between them. The crickets chirped in the darkness, filling the silence they couldn't seem to break. "What are we doing, Sarah?" Jake finally asked, his voice low. Sarah stared ahead, afraid to look at him. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean," he said gently. "There's something happening here between us. I feel it, and I think you feel it too." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had been trying so hard not to name the feelings growing inside her, afraid of what they meant. "Your family, Jake," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Not by blood," he reminded her, turning in his chair to face her. "And we barely knew each other before I came here. What I feel for you, it's not how I'd feel about family." Sarah finally looked at him, seeing the raw honesty in his eyes. "What do you feel?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. Jake reached across the space between them and took her hand. His touch sent warmth spreading through her body. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "And it scares me because I don't know if you feel the same, or if you do, whether you'll let yourself admit it." Sarah couldn't speak. The words she wanted to say were caught in her throat, held back by fears and doubts. Jake squeezed her hand once and then let go. "You don't have to say anything now, but Lisa's coming in 2 weeks, and we need to figure out what we're going to do." He stood up and walked inside, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the night sounds of the farm. She stayed there for a long time, looking at the stars and thinking about how her life had changed since Jake arrived. She had come to the farm to find peace after losing her parents, expecting loneliness. Instead, she had found something else, something unexpected and complicated and beautiful, and now she had to decide whether to embrace it or turn away. When Sarah finally went inside, the house was quiet. She paused outside Jake's door, her hand raised to knock, but in the end she continued to her own room, still not sure what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Sarah checked the weather radio and heard warnings of a severe summer storm heading their way. She found Jake in the barn, already preparing for the bad weather. "We need to secure everything," he said without looking at her. His voice was different, more formal than usual. Last night's conversation hung between them like a shadow. They worked side by side but not together, moving around each other carefully, avoiding touch. Sarah hated the distance, but didn't know how to bridge it. Every time she looked at Jake, she saw the hurt in his eyes from her silence the night before. By midday, the wind picked up. They worked faster, bringing animals into the barn, covering sensitive crops with tarps. The first heavy raindrops fell as they finished tying down the last cover in the vegetable garden. "Let's get inside," Jake shouted over the rising wind. But before they could reach the house, the storm hit with full force. Rain poured down in sheets, and lightning cracked across the sky. "The barn is closer," Sarah yelled, grabbing Jake's arm. They ran through the downpour, water soaking through their clothes in seconds. Inside the barn, they stood dripping, catching their breath. The animals moved restlessly in their stalls, disturbed by the thunder. Jake began checking on them, speaking in soft, calming tones. Sarah watched him, her heart aching with feelings she could no longer deny. "The roof is leaking," Jake called, pointing to water dripping through the ceiling near the back of the barn. "We need to put something under it." They found old buckets and placed them to catch the leaks. As they worked, the worst of the storm passed over them. The barn creaked and groaned with each powerful gust of wind. "Do you think the house is okay?" Sarah asked, worried about the old farmhouse. "It stood through worse," Jake reassured her, but his eyes showed concern too. Suddenly, a loud crack sounded overhead. Jake reacted instantly, pulling Sarah away just as a section of the roof gave way. They fell together onto a pile of hay, Jake's body covering hers protectively. For a moment, they lay still, hearts racing from the near miss. Rain poured through the new hole in the roof, but they were safe in their corner. Jake lifted himself slightly to look at her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his face inches from hers, eyes searching her features. Sarah shook her head, unable to speak. In that moment, with Jake's weight pressed against her and his breath warm on her face, all her doubts washed away like the rain outside. She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Jake went very still, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered, the words finally free. "I've been fighting it because I was afraid of what it meant, what others would think, but I don't want to fight it anymore." Jake's expression softened, hope replacing the hurt in his eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the rain. Sarah nodded, and as if drawn by an invisible force, they moved together. Their lips met in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened, years of family ties transforming into something new and wonderful. Jake's hands tangled in her wet hair as Sarah pulled him closer, their bodies fitting together perfectly. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Jake rested his forehead against hers, a smile spreading across his face. "I've wanted to do that since the day I arrived," he admitted. Sarah laughed softly, happiness bubbling up inside her. "Even when I was covered in mud and yelling at the tractor?" "Especially then," Jake said, kissing her again briefly. "You looked beautiful, all fired up and determined." The storm continued around them, but in their corner of the barn, they created their own shelter. Jake pulled an old blanket from a shelf and wrapped it around them both as they settled into the hay. "What about Lisa?" Sarah asked after a while, reality intruding on their moment. Jake took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "We'll tell her the truth, that we found each other here on this farm. That what we have is real." Sarah nodded, leaning against his shoulder. The fear was still there, but it seemed smaller now, less important than the joy of being in Jake's arms. Outside, the storm began to ease, the violent downpour softening to a gentle rain. Inside, Sarah and Jake remained entwined, watching water drip through the damaged roof, planning repairs they would make together, and stealing kisses between whispered words of love. The days after the storm passed in a sweet haze. Sarah and Jake worked together repairing storm damage, their hands finding excuses to touch, their eyes meeting in glances that said more than words. At night, they sat closer on the porch, fingers intertwined, sharing kisses under the stars. But as Lisa's visit grew closer, Sarah's worries returned. They were sitting at the kitchen table having breakfast when she finally voiced her fears. "What if she doesn't understand?" Sarah asked, pushing her eggs around her plate. "What if she hates me for this?" Jake reached across the table and took her hand. "Lisa loves us both. She might be surprised at first, but she'll see how happy we are." Sarah wasn't so sure. "She sent you here to help me with the farm, not to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Not to fall in love with you?" Jake completed for her, his voice gentle. "That wasn't planned, but it happened. And it's the best thing that's ever happened to me." His words warmed her heart, but the worry remained. They had only one more day before Lisa would arrive. Sarah spent it cleaning the house nervously while Jake finished mending the barn roof. That evening, Jake found Sarah in the garden, picking fresh vegetables for tomorrow's dinner. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pressing a kiss to her neck. "Stop worrying," he whispered against her skin. "Everything will be fine." Sarah turned in his arms, looking up at his face, now deeply tanned from working outdoors. "How can you be so sure?" "Because this is right," he said simply. "Us together. It feels right." And when he kissed her slow and deep in the garden they had built together, Sarah believed him. They made their way back to the house, stopping every few steps for another kiss, as if they couldn't bear to be apart even for a moment. At night, Sarah lay in Jake's arms in her bed, now their bed, listening to his steady breathing as he slept. Tomorrow would change everything, for better or worse. She finally drifted off, comforted by Jake's warmth beside her. Lisa's car arrived just after lunch the next day. Sarah's hands shook as she watched her sister get out of the car. Jake stood beside her on the porch, a solid, reassuring presence. "Look at this place," Lisa exclaimed as she walked up the path. "It looks amazing." She hugged Sarah first, then Jake, not noticing the tension between them. As they showed her around the farm, Lisa kept commenting on all the improvements, how healthy the crops looked, how well maintained everything was. "You two make quite a team," she said as they walked back to the house. "I had a feeling this arrangement would work out well." Sarah and Jake exchanged a glance. Now was the time to tell her, but the words stuck in Sarah's throat. They sat down for the dinner they had prepared together. Lisa talked about her job in the city, asking questions about the farm's finances, the plans for the fall harvest. Normal family conversation, and with each passing minute, Sarah's courage faded. Under the table, Jake squeezed her hand. She looked up to find him watching her with patient eyes. He would wait, she knew, until she was ready. "Lisa," Sarah finally said during a pause in the conversation, "there's something we need to tell you." Lisa set down her fork, her eyes moving between them. "What is it? You're not selling the farm, are you?" "No," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she expected. "It's about Jake and me." She took a deep breath. "We've fallen in love." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Lisa's expression was unreadable. Sarah felt Jake's hand tighten around hers. "I see," Lisa finally said, her voice careful. "When did this happen?" "It just happened," Jake said. "We didn't plan it or expect it." Lisa looked at their joined hands on the table, then back at their faces. "Are you happy?" she asked simply. The question surprised Sarah. Of all the reactions she had imagined, this wasn't one of them. "Yes," she answered honestly, "happier than I've ever been." Lisa nodded slowly. "And you?" she asked Jake, her son in every way but blood. "I love her," Jake said, the certainty in his voice making Sarah's heart swell. "More than I thought possible." Lisa was quiet for another long moment. Then, to Sarah's surprise, a small smile appeared on her face. "I always did worry about both of you being alone," she said softly. "I never imagined this solution, but I can see you're good for each other." Sarah felt tears of relief fill her eyes. "You're not angry." "How could I be angry at two people I love finding happiness?" Lisa asked. "It's unexpected, yes, but life often is." She reached across the table and took their joined hands in hers. "Just be good to each other," she said. "That's all I ask." Later that night, after Lisa had gone to bed in the guest room, Sarah and Jake stood on their porch, arms around each other. "See?" Jake whispered, kissing the top of her head. "I told you it would be okay." Sarah smiled up at him, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "You were right. Now we can just be us, without hiding." Under the summer stars, they sealed this new beginning with a kiss that promised many more to come. Summer gave way to autumn, bringing cooler days and the busy harvest season. Lisa's visit and blessing had removed a weight from Sarah and Jake's shoulders. They worked harder than ever, preparing the farm for winter, but now they did it as a true couple, no longer hiding their feelings. One crisp October morning, they drove the first load of apples to the farmer's market in town. Sarah watched as Jake charmed the customers with his easy smile and knowledge of the different apple varieties they had grown. She felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot cider they were selling. "Your boyfriend is quite the salesman," an older woman remarked to Sarah as Jake wrapped up her purchase. Sarah smiled, not bothering to correct her. Boyfriend seemed too simple a word for what Jake had become to her. Partner. Love. Future. That afternoon, as they drove home with empty crates and a good profit, Jake reached over and took her hand. "I was thinking," he said, his eyes on the road ahead, "now that we've had such a good harvest, maybe we could start making some improvements to the house." "What did you have in mind?" Sarah asked, enjoying the way his thumb rubbed circles on her palm. "The kitchen is outdated, and the upstairs bathroom needs work." He glanced at her quickly. "If I'm going to stay permanently, I mean." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. They hadn't talked much about the future, both content to enjoy each day as it came. "Is that what you want, to stay permanently?" Jake pulled the truck over to the side of the road and turned to face her. "Sarah, I can't imagine being anywhere else. This farm with you, it's everything I've ever wanted." Sarah leaned across the seat and kissed him, feeling his smile against her lips. "Then yes, let's renovate. Make it ours." They celebrated that night with a special dinner harvested entirely from their land. Jake opened a bottle of wine they had been saving, and they toasted to their future. Later, they sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, making plans for the farm's next season. "We could expand the vegetable garden," Jake suggested, his fingers playing with Sarah's hair. "Maybe start selling at more markets." "And what about getting more animals?" Sarah asked, leaning back against his chest. "I've always wanted to try making cheese." They talked late into the night, their dreams for the farm growing bigger with each passing hour. When they finally went upstairs to bed, the old house didn't seem outdated anymore. It felt like the perfect foundation for their future. The next few weeks passed in a blur of harvesting, canning, and preparing the fields for their winter rest. They worked from sunrise to sunset most days, falling into bed exhausted but satisfied. One evening, Sarah came in from storing the last of the pumpkins to find Jake in the kitchen, cooking dinner. The table was set with their best dishes and candles, something they never used on ordinary days. "What's all this?" she asked, surprised. "I thought we deserved a special night," Jake said, kissing her cheek as he passed. "Go wash up. Dinner's almost ready." When Sarah returned, Jake had dimmed the lights and soft music played from the old radio. He held out her chair, and she sat down, touched by his thoughtfulness. The meal was delicious. Roast chicken with vegetables from their garden and freshly baked bread. They talked and laughed, enjoying the break from their busy schedule. After dessert, Jake refilled their wine glasses and took a deep breath. "Sarah," he began, his voice different than usual, more serious. "These past months have been the happiest of my life." Sarah reached for his hand across the table. "Mine too. I came here looking for a temporary place to stay, to figure out my next step," Jake continued. "But I found so much more. I found home. I found you." He stood up suddenly and moved to her side of the table. Sarah's breath caught as he knelt down beside her chair. "I don't have much to offer except my love and my promise to work by your side every day," Jake said, pulling a small box from his pocket. "But if that's enough, I'm asking you to marry me." He opened the box to reveal a simple ring with a small diamond. "It was my grandmother's, my adoptive grandmother, I mean. Lisa sent it to me last week when I called to ask for her blessing." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she looked at the man kneeling before her. The farm had brought her many gifts, but none as precious as Jake's love. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Yes, I'll marry you." Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, his own hands trembling slightly. Then he stood and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his joy. Their kiss tasted of wine and tears and promises. The first snow fell early that winter, covering the farm in a blanket of white. Sarah woke to find Jake already gone from their bed. She wrapped herself in a warm robe and went to the window. Below, she could see his footprints in the fresh snow, leading toward the barn. With a smile, she dressed quickly and made her way downstairs. Coffee was already made, still warm. Jake always thought of these small comforts. She poured a cup for him too and followed his tracks outside. The world had transformed overnight. The old farm looked like something from a fairy tale, the trees heavy with snow, the fields pure white under the morning sun. Sarah's breath made clouds in the cold air as she walked carefully to the barn. Inside, she found Jake feeding the animals. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting up at the sight of her. Even after all these months, his smile still made her heart skip. "I brought you coffee," she said, holding out the steaming mug. "You're perfect," Jake replied, taking it gratefully. They stood side by side, watching the snow fall through the open barn door. The engagement ring on Sarah's finger caught the light, still new enough that she found herself looking at it several times a day. "I was thinking," Jake said, putting his arm around her, "we should set a date." Sarah leaned into him, enjoying his warmth. "For the wedding?" "Spring, maybe, when the apple trees bloom." The idea made Sarah smile. "That would be beautiful. Out in the orchard." "Exactly what I was thinking," Jake said, kissing the top of her head. Later that morning, they sat at the kitchen table with calendars and lists, planning their future. They decided on a small ceremony in April, just family and a few friends. Lisa would come a week early to help with preparations. They would renovate the old guest house on the property for visitors. As the day went on, the snow continued to fall. By afternoon, they were completely snowed in. Jake built a fire in the living room while Sarah made soup from vegetables they had preserved from their garden. "I'm glad we're stuck here together," Jake said as they settled on the couch with bowls of hot soup. Just the two of us. Me too, Sarah agreed, tucking her feet under his leg for warmth. As evening approached, the power went out. They lit candles and added more wood to the fire, creating a cozy glow in the old farmhouse. Outside, the world was silent except for the occasional sound of snow falling from tree branches. I have something for you, Jake said suddenly, getting up from the couch. He returned with a small package wrapped in brown paper. I was saving it for Christmas, but tonight seems right. Sarah unwrapped it carefully to find a beautiful handmade book. Opening it, she saw that Jake had filled the first few pages with photos of them and the farm, notes about their first months together, pressed flowers from their garden. It's a memory book, he explained. I thought we could fill it together. Our story. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she touched the pages. Jake, it's perfect. Look at the last page, he said softly. Sarah turned to the end of the book and found a sketch of the farmhouse, but changed. There was an addition on one side, a larger porch, flower gardens. Is this how I see our future? Jake finished for her. Room for us to grow. Maybe even start a family someday if you want that. Sarah looked up at him, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. I want everything with you, she whispered. Jake took her face in his hands and kissed her deeply. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but they were warm in their cocoon of candlelight and love. Later, lying in bed, Sarah listened to the wind outside and Jake's steady breathing beside her. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, from strangers who shared a family connection to lovers planning a life together. What are you thinking about? Jake asked sleepily, pulling her closer. How lucky I am, Sarah answered, resting her head on his chest. That Lisa sent you here. That we found each other. It wasn't luck, Jake murmured, his voice drifting toward sleep. It was always meant to be. Sarah smiled in the darkness, her fingers finding his. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps all the loss and struggles in her life had been leading her here, to this farm, to this man, to this love. Outside, snow covered their fields, protecting the seeds sleeping beneath the ground. Inside, Sarah and Jake held each other, dreaming of spring, of apple blossoms, of wedding vows, and of all the seasons they would share on this land that had brought them together. The farm that had once been her burden had become their blessing, and as Sarah drifted to sleep in Jake's arms, she knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, just as they had faced the storm that first brought them into each other's arms.